so important to ask and to believe. All right, we have been rolling through the book of Genesis. Last week we talked about Abraham, or Abram at this point, rescuing his nephew Lot, being blessed by Melchizedek. This week we jump into Genesis 15, and we are going to read together. It says this. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and number the stars if you are able to number them. And God said to him, So shall your offspring be. And Abram believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But Abram said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? God said, Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. So he brought him all these and cut them in half. And he laid each half over against the other. But he didn't cut the birds in half, and when birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. And behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, Know for certain, your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there. And they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I'll bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go down to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. When the sun had gone down, and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. There are a number of things going on in this text. We're going to draw a few things out of it. The first is this. Declarations from God in the scriptures need to be filtered carefully when they are being applied to us. But they often can be applied to us, even if not directly. So let me explain what I mean by that. It's a bit of a mouthful. God makes this declaration to Abram. He says, I am your shield. Your reward will be great. And what's easy to do at that point, and honestly, a lot of modern preaching does do this, is just say, man, if God is Abram's shield and reward, then he'll be your shield and reward too. Right? Like, that's an easy message to pull out of this. Be like, oh, God's Abram's shield, he's your shield. God's going to protect you. God is your reward. Boom, you've got your sermon right there. I want to caution us to be careful, though, about inserting ourselves directly into every text that we read, because it can actually get us in a little bit of trouble. So I'll say this. Every text of Scripture has something for you and I to learn from it. Not every text in Scripture is immediately about you or I. So let me explain what I mean when I say this. One of the most quoted verses or passages of Scripture that you will see is 2 Chronicles 7:14. Some of you guys could just rip that off by memory. It says this: "If my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, I will forgive their sin, and I will heal their land." Man, anybody ever quoted that verse, right? We love that verse, especially around election times. We're like, God, please help our country, right? Or maybe you've heard that verse used as a call to prayer, or I see it, man, I'm just going to be honest, I see it posted on social media all the time, but it's actually a little bit problematic to grab that and apply it to us one for one. So let me explain why. Last week, we said that the Bible is a book of covenants. And a covenant is a solemn agreement between two parties. It's just kind of the baseline for what a covenant is. And within the Bible, you're going to see a number of covenants, but three are really going to stick out. The first is this covenant that we're reading about this morning, which is the covenant with Abram. And then there's going to be two covenants that are going to kind of fall off of that or develop under that. The first is pre-Jesus, and we call it the Mosaic or the Old Covenant. It revolves around the law given to Moses, right? That's the Old Covenant is what we often refer to it as. The second covenant is going to be what we refer to as the New Covenant, and is under Jesus as a result of his life, his death, and his resurrection, right? So we're all on the same page with that, right? The Bible is a book of covenants. Under the pre-Jesus covenant, the Mosaic one, God's people relate to him through what is called the law, right? Specifically, if they will keep the law, then they will possess the land of promise and will dwell in it and be blessed. So one of the realities of the Mosaic law is that the people's relationship to the land actually is a signifier of their relationship to God. So if they are faithful and they are obedient, they will dwell in the land and the land will be blessed. God says it will produce for them, and that will be a sign of their obedience and God's faithfulness. But if they fail to keep the law, the land itself that God promises to them will be cursed. Right? It won't produce for them. There will be drought. They will start getting hungry. And then ultimately, if they continue in disobedience and continue to lack faithfulness, what God says is he will actually up and remove them from the land of promise, and they will end up in neighboring nations that don't fear the Lord as the ultimate covenant, old covenant curse being removed from the land. Right? So for the Mosaic covenant, you see that God's people's relationship to him is very much tied to the land of promise. And in that context, you read 2 Chronicles, and God is saying, man, if the land isn't producing, you need to humble yourselves. You need to turn from your wicked ways, and then I will heal your land. It'll start producing, and you can go back to being blessed in the land. All right, so you tracking with me there? That's the immediate context that this is taking place in. And then what happens is you track to the end of the Old Covenant, the Old Testament scriptures, and you get to what we call the New Testament or the New Covenant. And the New Covenant says within its writings, which we call the New Testament, that the Old Covenant was a school teacher or a tutor. Essentially, that from Genesis through to Malachi, all of that was to prepare God's people for Jesus. And then what happens is, under the covenant that Jesus makes, we see an expansion where there is no longer just a physical land where God's people dwell, kind of relegated to a small portion of the planet, but rather that God's people dwell in all nations and are a spiritual people who are receiving a spiritual promise, which is the kingdom of heaven. And then within that reality, God's people are tracking towards a new heavens and a new earth when Jesus returns. So the whole trajectory is not just one piece of land, but that God will send his son, Jesus will return, he will reign, and his people will come under his reign and get everything as God subjects it to himself. But until then, within the New Testament scriptures, we see that we have a spiritual place, not a physical place. It's the reason that Christian nationalism is dumb. I'll just leave that statement sit there. So all of that being said, we can't one for one read 2 Chronicles 7:14 into our text into our context, because Canada is not a theocracy. Meaning it's not a nation directly ruled by God the way that ancient Israel was. And so, we don't have a covenant with him in which our land is either blessed or cursed based on whether we are being faithful or obedient. But we can and should still take something from 2 Chronicles 7. It just needs to understand the differences in the Old and the New Covenant. So what should we take from that? Well, let me tell you. God's people should be a people who turn from wicked constantly. God's people should be a people who are seeking his face. God's people should be a people who are humbling themselves. God's people should be a people that know that he is healing us within the context of the kingdom of heaven. And then we could take that and say, man, this becomes a communal reality. Right? This becomes a communal reality, not just an individual one, where God is dealing with his people as a community, not just you or me or you or you or you or you or you. Right? So then as believers, both local and global, we need to make sure that we have a practice of consistently turning towards him. Not just you as an individual, us as a people. I want you to grasp this morning. We're going to get back to kind of where we started on this in a moment. But this is so important to understand. God relates to us as a community. God relates to us as a people. And what's happened is we have had it hammered into our heads so resolutely that we are to relate to God individually that I think oftentimes in evangelical contexts especially, we have missed the reality that God deals with us as a community. Right? Because we've sat in services, we've sat in camps, we've listened to preachers constantly say, your personal relationship with Jesus matters. Right? And we've heard statements like, there are no grandkids in the kingdom of heaven, and that's not wrong, but what we've done is we've just hammered in your personal responsibility. And I think at times we forgot that God relates to us as a community. And so our holiness matters. Our obedience matters. And what happens within the scriptures is you see that God looks at us as a community, but then when someone within the community steps out, it actually has implications for the whole. Man, you look at Achan. Can't even pull the Achan text up in my head. It's in the Pentateuch. Achan is this guy as Israel is heading into the land of promise who sees some stuff that he likes a lot. But God had told the people of Israel to destroy everything. I believe it was Jericho, right? To destroy everything, not take anything, because he was just going to wipe this city, this place off the map. But Achan sees this stuff he likes, so he takes it and he buries all of it and hides it in his tent. And then as Israel goes out to their next battle, rather than having victory, which they assume they will have because God is with them, they actually suffer defeat. And the one person's sin has an effect on the entire community. Right, so I just want you to hear this morning, that God relates to us as a community. And the community within the scriptures is almost always addressed before the individual. So listen to me. Christianity is not just about you and how you relate to it, or me and how I relate to it, but about us. And if that grinds your individualistic gears, I'm not sorry. Show me where I'm wrong in the scriptures. Let's put it that way. So we are then responsible to follow Jesus together, not as individuals. So listen, as awesome as you may be, you need me and I need you. That is the way that God has made his people to work. That's the way that God relates to us, yes, as individuals, but also, and I would even say first, as a community of faith. So then we come back to our text for this morning and we say, okay, what does all of that have to do with where we're at? What it has to do is we need to see that we can't always just immediately apply an Old Testament text to us one for one. In the case of Abram, when we're reading this, we see God is his shield. Why? Because he is the father of the nation from which Jesus will come. So God is going to keep him and protect him for the job and the task that he has for him. And then also we see that God is going to give him a great reward, which is the fulfillment of the promise he makes to him. His descendants will be a great nation, and all people will be blessed through his future descendant, Jesus Christ. And so then when we begin to see that, we take that and say, God does protect us within the context of accomplishing what he wants to accomplish through us. Then we could take that even further and say that God does reward us, and that reward is the reality of the promise made to Abraham like 4,000 years ago, which is that all people will be blessed through Abram's descendant, Jesus Christ. Friends, listen to me. Jesus is the reward. Jesus is the reward. And I don't want us to forget that. Christ is enough. He is our reward. A glimpse of him is greater than any good thing we will ever know or experience in this life. Second thing we draw out of this text is that God's favorite miracle, or at least one of them, is bringing life where there should not be any life. See, we see constantly there's this back and forth between God and Abram in the promise, or in the process of God promising Abram descendants. God will come and say, I'm going to make your descendants into a great nation. And Abram will go, God, I got a problem here. I don't have any descendants and I am old. You keep saying that I'm going to be a great nation. Man, Abram's over 90 at this point. And listen to me, there's no little blue pill being obnoxiously advertised on his social media feeds, right? Too far? Too much information? Pushing 40 does funny things to your algorithms, man. All right, it's almost like, this is too much information, I shouldn't have said that. It's almost like God is waiting until it is literally impossible, and then he's going to come through on his promise to Abraham. And what this is going to do, first and foremost, is ultimately point us to Jesus. Why? Because Jesus literally dies. I don't know about you. I don't know anybody who's risen from the dead. I'm not saying it can't happen. I kind of actually believe that it could in a context of what Jesus does. But it is not physically possible to just get up and stop being dead. All of this points us to these promises that we see where God's like, I'm going to wait until it's literally impossible, and then I'm going to bring life to dead places, is preparing his people for Jesus, who literally dies and comes back to life, defeating death once and for all. And you might be listening, you're like, well, Jared, if Jesus defeated death once and for all, why do we still die? And that's a good question. What I'd say to that is Jesus has won the victory. It will be consummated when he returns. It's a little bit like putting a down payment on a house. You put the down payment down, you get everything ready. There's still a move-in date, a possession date that comes. When we talk about the gospel, right? When we talk about what Jesus has done, the down payment is paid. He owns the house. Possession date is coming. And we can take all of that and say that at times, many times, God performs the same kind of miracle leading up to Jesus, preparing his people to see that reality. God brings life where there is no life. We're going to see that with Sarah. We're going to see that with Rachel. We're going to see that with Hannah. You track through the Old Testament, you're going to see this time and time and time again. When things look impossible and dead, God is in the business of bringing life. Jesus is in the business of bringing life. And listen, I'm not saying that all of your stuff is always going to work out the way that you envision it working out. What I am saying is God is constantly, historically, doing ridiculous things that look like life from death, so don't count him out. Don't stop praying. Don't stop believing he can bring life to dead marriage. Don't stop believing that he can resurrect your spiritually dead loved one or dear friend. Don't stop believing that he can physically heal. Don't stop believing that he can resurrect a dead relationship. He can. And listen, I'm not a word faith guy. Word faith theology teaches if you just have enough faith, what you want or claim in that faith will happen. It's like Christian nationalism. It's dumb. And a whole lot of other things that I can't say or I would be looking for a new job. But at the same time, God can and has and will do impossible things, often in spite of us. And so, man, it is okay to ask and to believe for God to bring life where it looks like there is only death. And all of that then fits in and ties into the greatest way that he does this, which is to bring spiritual life to spiritually dead places, which, man, if you pay attention to the scriptures, is every single human heart outside of belief in Jesus. The whole point, I've said this, I'll say it again. The whole point here is that God is constantly opening dry wombs to show us how salvation works. Once you look, God would look and say, man, that was dead. Watch this. Now it's alive. Jesus makes spiritually dead people come to life. So listen to me. If you have not been resurrected by Jesus, man, you need to come to life. If you have not trusted in Jesus, friend, listen to me, you are spiritually dead. Jesus is standing here and he is offering you spiritual life by trusting in him. One of my favorite stories of this is the preacher Charles Haddon Spurgeon. Charles Haddon Spurgeon, his conversion story is fantastic. He makes his way at some point, he's a young dude, into this little country church. There had been a snowstorm. The regular preacher wasn't able to make it out. And so one of the guys from the congregation got up and essentially just said over and over and over again, look to him. Look to him. You got trouble in your life? Look to him. Are you spiritually needing? Look to, like just over and over again. Look to him. And Spurgeon heard that and he was like, okay, I need to look to God. I need to look to Christ. And then he became one of the greatest preachers of all time. But, you know, that's probably not going to be all of us. It's definitely not me. Anyways, right, but there's this idea that we look to him and he resurrects us. Third thing that we draw out of this text is that righteousness comes through belief. During this particular exchange, God tells Abram to go out and look at the stars. Thank the Lord, Abram lived in the Middle East and there was no social media, so God didn't have to worry about seeing pictures of the northern lights for the next 6 days straight, right? God says, man, you go out and you try and count those things. If you can count those things, that's what your offspring are going to be like. And then one of the most important statements in all of the scriptures happens. It says this: Abram believed God, and God counted it to him as righteousness. So let's do a little bit of work here. Righteousness is exactly what it sounds like it should be. It's doing the right thing. The problem that we run into is this: none of us does the right thing all the time, if even most of the time. One of the preachers I really liked to listen to, especially as I was learning to preach, used to say something like this to kind of press people on this. If you had the option of coming and hooking up your thoughts on a given day and projecting them on a screen so all the rest of us could see what's going through your head, not a single one of us would be like, yeah, I think I'll do that. Right? Because our hearts betray us. We aren't righteous. And man, this is the same thing with Abram. We have talked about the problems that this guy has. Listen to me. Abram is a spineless dude. Like spineless. Guy could be an amoeba. Like you just read about it and time again, he is just capitulating to the situations that are going on around him. We see that again next week with Sarai and Hagar. And so we have to ask, how is it that this guy who doesn't do the right thing often gets credited with being righteous? How does that happen? And the picture that the scriptures show us is not that it's okay to do the wrong thing as long as you kind of have mental assent that God exists, but that when you believe what God says, he considers you righteous. All right, so now we have a little bit more work to do to understand this. This type of righteousness, where you could kind of say, well, all he had to do was believe and he was righteous, that kind of righteousness does not lower God's standard. Listen to me. The standard is perfection. I always love when you sit in services or you talk with people and like, and God doesn't care if you got your stuff together. God doesn't need you to be perfect, right? You hear this over and over again where it's like God will come down and meet, and I understand the intent in it. The intent is to say God can meet you where you're at, which is true. But to say that God doesn't need or want you to be perfect is actually patently false. Over and over again in the scriptures, you see God say things like, be holy as I am holy. How holy is God? God is perfect. So then what's the expectation for his creatures? The expectation is that they would be perfect like he is perfect. That's why the gospel is so beautiful. Because while you and I and Abram were not perfect, Jesus is. And he gives us his perfection when we trust in him. This is where 2 Corinthians 5:21 lives. God made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, that we might become the righteousness of God. Jesus does the work, and man, we shamelessly ride his coattails. So that's the first truth. God doesn't lower his standards. The second truth is that there are two different spheres of righteousness within the scriptures. One is what we call positional righteousness, and one is what we call practical righteousness. I've used this illustration a million times. I will probably use it a million more. Half of you at least know what I'm about to say. It is like joining a sports team, right? When you join a sports team, you go out the first time that you're playing that sport, you put on the equipment, you join the practice, man, you are on the team. But you still got a long ways to go before you're really like on the team, right? Where you're contributing, where you are becoming a member or a player of that sport. So when I joined football as a 9-year-old dude in America, because they're crazy, I was a football player. I still had a long ways to go in becoming a football player. So track with me. When we believe in God's promise, which is realized in Jesus, we are on Team Jesus. When you trust Christ, you are righteous. And then his Spirit is going to press that righteousness into your heart, into your mind, into your soul, into your life, and you will become more and more like him as he works in you to make that positional righteousness a practical reality. And the good news in this is this: when you trip and fall, which you will, you don't lose the position of being righteous. You've made a practical error, you get back up and you continue to walk in the position that you are already in. Jesus is our righteousness. So what's happening all the way back in the book of Genesis that we are reading is that Abraham's belief puts him in a position of righteousness in God's eyes. He believed and God credited it to him as righteousness. Now, at this point, you might say, well, Jared, Abraham is pre-Jesus, so how does that work? Because Jesus hadn't come yet. Jesus hadn't died yet. 2 Corinthians sure hadn't been written yet. How is it that the righteousness of Jesus can be applied to Abraham? The reason that this works is because God's promise to his people has always been about Jesus. So even when we are reading in the Old Testament back in Genesis that God's people are trusting his promises, that's pointing towards trusting in Jesus. What they saw was shadowed, it was veiled, Christ hadn't been revealed yet, and they were trusting God at the same time to bring about his promise, to bring about his redemption. They just didn't know how it would play out yet. So all of that being said, the invitation is for all of us to believe in God and to be righteous. Then the last thing that we draw out of this text is that God takes responsibility for his covenant. So we get this kind of, man, it is honestly just this weird kind of bizarre text. Abraham brings out a heifer and a goat and a ram and a turtle dove. Man, it sounds like he's about to bring out a partridge in a pear tree. Like he's just got the list of everything going on. And he kills them. And then he lays these animals out, and all of them except for the birds, he cuts them in half. And then you read these birds of prey come down to get at these carcasses, and Abram kind of runs out and drives them away. And then the sun goes down, and Abram falls asleep. And there's this terror that comes upon him. And within all of this, God shows up and makes him a promise that his offspring would be sojourners in a land that aren't their own, but that he would deliver them and bring them out with great possessions. And then this is maybe the most bizarre part. This smoking oven shows up and passes between the halves of the animals. And as that's happening, God makes this covenant with Abram. He says, this land is going to belong to your offspring. So let's talk for a minute about what's going on here. There is, I think, sufficient evidence that splitting animals apart the way that Abram does in this text was a custom used in ancient Near Eastern covenant ceremonies. And there's a few things that we know about covenants. First is this: in an ancient Near Eastern context, they're not unilateral. Meaning that it's not like two equal people coming and standing and making a promise to each other, kind of like we would have with a wedding ceremony, right? Where you get up and you covenant, you make a promise, a solemn promise to another person who is your equal, or in my case, she was my better and still is. right? But this isn't what that was like. This covenant idea in the ancient Near East is that a strong king or a strong political leader would make a covenant with a weaker party. And that weaker party would then essentially come under the umbrella of that stronger party. But there were stipulations, man. There were things that that weaker party had to do. And if they broke that covenant, this whole ceremony was actually a symbol. And the weaker party would walk through the pieces that were split in half, and essentially that would say, hey, if I break this covenant, this is what's going to happen to me. If I don't keep this covenant, may this be my reality. Which is, man, honestly kind of gross because slitting people in half doesn't sound like a lot of fun. If it does to you, come find me afterwards. We need to talk. But what's unique about this particular instance is that God shows up, and darkness and fire and smoke and dread are kind of the reality of this scene, which are all signs of what we call a theophany. And a theophany is God showing up in some physical manifestation. And every time you see this in the scriptures, you see some of these signs. You see fire, you see darkness, you see smoke. Earthquakes are another one, right? So you can look forward and even say, man, this is actually probably imaging a little bit the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire that are going to lead God's people out of Egypt. You could fast forward a whole lot more and you could get to the death and resurrection of Jesus in Luke 23:24. It says darkness covers the entire land in the middle of the day. Or Matthew 27 says the earth shakes when Jesus dies. For a Jewish reader who understands theophany, God is not absent in the death of Christ. He's actually very present. And what happens in our text this morning is this theophany, this smoking oven, this physical manifestation of God's presence passes through these carcasses, and God makes his covenant with Abraham, but he does it in a different way than the world would do it. Where the worldly kings would say, man, if you don't keep this word, your word, this is what's going to happen to you. God says, listen to me, if I don't keep my word, so may this happen to me. It is a complete reversal, friends, where God takes the onus upon himself. The weight of his promises, he says, I am faithful. I will come through. I'll bear the punishment for failure in the covenant. So look at me and listen to me this morning. Despite your shortcomings, despite your failures, despite your sin, despite your moments of stupidity where you're just like, I can't believe I've done this. The good news of the gospel is that God is the one who bears the weight of failure of the punishment. He doesn't send you through the animals. He doesn't put you on the cross. He goes there himself. So some of you need to hear this morning. If you believe, not only are you righteous, but man, he's got you. He's paid the price. He's taken the covenant on his own shoulders. So for some of you, you need to hear that, and you need to just breathe. God's salvation of you does not depend on you, it depends on him. That's not saying you don't have to believe. That's not saying that there's no action for you to take as a result of that. That's saying that there is nothing you can do to add to what he has done. He's already paid the price. He has got you. So this morning I'm going to invite you to stand with me. I know some of this has been kind of technical. But at the end of the day, I think and I hope we're understanding what this text is getting at. God is the one who makes things happen. God is the one who takes onus for his own covenant with us. We stand under his grace when we believe we are righteous in him. So as we reflect on that, let's just sing together and give him glory for what he's done.